I'm Fred Alley, the chair of the board of the Center on Philanthropy and Public Policy. And this has been a really exciting 2 days. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. I want to start off, before I introduce our closing plenary, I want to remind people that the center is within the Price School of Public Policy at the University of Southern California, which means there are students there. And I have been so pleased this last semester to actually be teaching a course in the school, and my students are all here. And in fact, yesterday I threatened to take, they have to be here, it's part of my course. And yesterday I threatened to actually take attendance. But I don't need to, because they've been here and they've been diligently going to all of our sessions. So I want you to stand up. I want to remind people why part of the reason we do this work. So this is an incredibly bright group of young people who are the future of this field. And so now you know where they all are. And so get to know them, offer them jobs. They're a great group. Thank you. So this has been a great 2 days. We started off yesterday with a great opening panel talking about government and philanthropy working at the intersection. We had wonderful breakouts. Yesterday, I was so proud to hear Monica Lozano just give an outstanding keynote, reminded us of the power of collaboration. It couldn't have complemented the day any better than it did. This morning, we talked about wicked opportunities with Bill Eggers, and again, the breakouts following that were really, I understand, outstanding. I was moving around from one to the other, and I was very, very impressed. So it's been an exciting 2 days. I want to remind people that this would not be possible if it were not for a number of sponsors who have made this possible: JPMorgan Chase, Wells Fargo, Northrop Grumman, the Ralph M. Parsons Foundation, the Annenberg Foundation, the Bank of America, California Community Foundation, the California Wellness Foundation, and of course the Center's philanthropic partners who make the work of the Center possible on a day in and day out basis. I also want to acknowledge the work of the Center staff, who have worked so hard to make this possible. And in particular, I want to recognize sort of the leader of that activity, Jim Ferris, who has worked so hard, for so many months on putting this forum together. And I'm going to invite Jim up here in a moment. So we've had a great two days, and we're going to end the session with just an outstanding panel that I think brings everything together. And the panel, the topic of the panel is, what does philanthropy need to do differently? So Jim, do you want to come up and take it from here? So thank you all for your attendance. It's been great seeing a lot of good friends and colleagues.
I want to start by thanking all of y'all for coming and engaging in the conversations. I think the last couple of days have been energetic, thoughtful, insightful, and at times provocative, I hope, and has gotten you to start thinking about how you can do things differently. We started out yesterday with some discussion of big bets that 3 courageous foundation leaders are making. We talked about in more depth sort of how philanthropy and government intersect at public problem solving in a number of areas. And today we started talking about, well, how do we go about finding solutions and making them happen? So we have sort of a closing panel that's sort of unparalleled, I think. We have leaders from 4 important philanthropic institutions that sort of are all a bit differently. Carol Larson from the David and Lucile Packard Foundation, which is one of the, if not the largest family foundation in the United States. We have Dalila Scott Wilson from JPMorgan. So we have, a corporate foundation, a corporation that has a heavy role in sort of philanthropic efforts that are aligned with their businesses. So we don't always have the corporate sector in these conversations, so we're delighted Dalila is here. Hilary Pennington, I love your title, Vice President of Education, Creativity, and Free Expression. I think I want an endowed chair in that or something, especially the free expression part.
Yeah.
And then Chris Oechsli, who is, sort of turning off the lights at the largest philanthropic organization that, with a limited life, that actually is about to come to a close. And so they all have different vantage points on how do you go about solving problems, what are the strategies, the solutions, all that stuff. So I'm going to just sort of ask each of them a different question, and then hopefully they'll probe each other, and then we'll take it from there. So Carol, I'm going to start with you. The David and Lucile Packard Foundation recently celebrated their 50th anniversary, and there's this wonderful Bridgespan report that talks about the experience of the foundation and funder collaboratives. And some of those deal with government. And what did you learn from that look back, and sort of what are you taking forward as y'all do work, whether it's children or climate or oceans? You want to sort of share some thoughts with the group?
Yeah. So Jim asked us each to talk from the perspective of our foundations and maybe talk for about 5 minutes. So I thought I would pick up on that theme about family foundations and then collaboration, and then give a specific example. So we are, as I said, 52 years old now as a foundation. Sorry, and we, I'd say we aren't the largest family foundation. If the definition of a family foundation is the family has ultimate control, I would imagine Gates is the largest family foundation, or there might be some others. But we are significant in the sense that we're already in our 3rd generation. So our board consists, our day-to-day governing board is half family and half general trustees. So it's not family only. And on the family side, it's both 2nd generation, sons and daughters of Dave and Lucile, but also 3rd generation. So that's been, I think, my task as president, is to try to make those transitions in those generations while combining what I hope is the best of staffed philanthropy and professional philanthropy with that passion and experience of the family. So there's been so much about collaboration in the sessions here, both collaborations among foundations and then collaborations with government, that I thought I would just use this angle on it, and that I think that it comes from the family values that makes us collaborative as a foundation. Certainly foundations that aren't family foundations are very collaborative, but in our case, I've been president for 12 years now, and there hardly is ever a meeting that we aren't discussing some strategy or program area where there isn't a family member in particular, but one of our trustees will say, well, why aren't, who else is working on this, and why are we doing our own thing, and why aren't you working with them? And it just starts from the top. And then it goes into then being willing to give up a little bit on your particular area of focus, we're about early childhood, but we might need to collaborate with people who are about birth to 8. And so let's go a little bit of that specific focus. And then also in terms of sharing credit, that they are almost in the category that Bob Ross was talking about before, humble to a fault, or we want the grantees to be in the news, and we are constantly asking, when is it important for Packard? But it does make for a good collaborative team. So I would say collaboration, what we've learned over the years is it starts from the top, and you have to hire for it, and you have to keep reminding your board about what it leads to. So some of the things that we talk about in that Bridgespan report, and we identified 60 collaborations going on at the foundation at this time. We give away $300 million a year globally. But one is really having that culture about collaboration and pushing from the board and the CEO. Another is finding with your collaborators that sweet spot of shared goals, even if you're approaching the problem from different angles. Another is having a good agreement about decision making for that collaboration. Who's going to be taking the lead? How will you decide things as a group? Another is being willing to take that long view. I haven't been involved with any one of these that are real collaborations that are at least 10 years, 5 to 10 years or longer. And then within that long view, being really agile as to what it needs at the time. I mean, the speaker this morning talking about that ecosystem. That ecosystem changes as you collaborate, and so there are times when you're really pushing on research, or you're pushing on advocacy, or you're pushing on technical assistance, and that collaborative group has to keep changing. And then finally, really being able to stand firm. I mean, especially when we've been collaborating with government about we aren't going to take over on the long term a government function. Or, no, it isn't good enough that we do this together. We're doing it for a reason, and we want this kind of impact.
So California has one of the very best state park systems in the country, if not the world. Over 270 designated state parks, from oceans to deserts to mountains to urban areas. And you may all remember that in 2012, California was really facing a budget crisis, and the governor said, we're going to close down 70 of them. So Packard has long worked on open space and parks and recs in California. And we and a bunch of other funders, but really led by the Moore Foundation and Steve McCormick, who'd been head of Nature Conservancy, started to organize to say, how can we keep these parks from closing? Well, then the other shoe dropped, and that's that the head of the Parks Department in California was fired because $30 million wasn't accounted for in their budget. So the governor takes action and says, let's set up an advisory committee and really look at how do we make the Parks Department more sustainable, and how do we open it up to more people in California? How do we take into account the growing and changing population in California? So what happened was, under Moore Foundation's leadership with something called the Resource Legacy Fund, they gathered a bunch of us who'd been working on these issues, and we formed an MOU with the head of the Agency of Natural Resources, John Laird, to have the governor appoint an independent commission of high-profile people from diverse regions of the state, diverse sectors, that would be independent and hold a bunch of public hearings. I don't know if Manuel Pastor is still here, but he was on that commission. And this then led to a report with results, tough recommendations, both for what the Department of Parks needed to do internally, but also how they needed to change facing out. And the collaborators on this were Bechtel, Hewlett, Irvine, Marisla, Packard, and Moore Foundation. And so we all put in, I think it was $5.7 million for the first phase to have this independent commission do hearings, fund groups to appear, present ideas, run a number of projects. I mean, what would a Yelp for state parks look like, that you could actually go on an app and see ratings for different state parks? What would it look like to build very quick, low-cost cabins in state parks so that more people could take advantage of them? So this $5.7 million went to shaping those recommendations and being able to actually implement some of them. So the report comes out, and then the question is, how will the State Department of Parks change? So it could have all come to a crashing halt at that point, but a second MOU was entered into with the agency and with the State Department of Parks, agreeing to a transformation team within the State Department. And that is being facilitated by Deloitte, paid by the foundations, and with the backbone of Resource Legacy Fund. So we're now in an agreement through 2017, formal MOUs, But I just want to go back to my 7 things about why I'm excited about this and why I think this might work. You know, number 1, it was very consistent for us with the values of our foundation, these issues we'd been working on for 50 years in California. Number 2 is we had, I think, as a set of foundations, credibility with John Laird. We'd worked with him in many other causes within the state, so we had relationships with each other. We were able to really join around clear goals for this collaboration and what it would mean. We also had a formal MOU, and that was clear about how decisions would be made. We're taking the long view, and we've really adapted over time in terms of whether we're playing the inside game or the outside game, you know, applying pressure versus collaborating internally. So I'm really optimistic that these things will cause real change in the state. But I do think in the question of what do we need to do more of and how does a family foundation play into this, I think it's a great example of the kinds of things we can do together. And we definitely, I think, need to do more of these. So thanks.
Thanks, Carol. Dalila, JPMorgan, your title is Head of Global Philanthropy. You know, we've had a conversation recently with Peter here at the center, and he, you know, has a view, the JPMorgan view, that it's not about corporate social responsibility, but just corporate responsibility. You want to talk about that perspective and then how that works in a couple of areas, maybe youth opportunities or whatever you want to talk about.
First, thanks for inviting us to be here, because I don't think there are enough private sector players in the room today, unfortunately. The banks are represented here, but I think sometimes we're left out of this conversation. Sometimes that's with good reason. But that said, I do think the private sector has a lot to offer in this space. And hopefully, you know, we feel that we've done a great job of sort of bringing together what that means. Corporate foundations don't operate separately from the business, right? And I think people need to remember that. And many people who approach us, especially not-for-profits and partners we're working with, they're always thinking about our funding stream as sort of the number one asset we bring to the table. So we're fortunate to have, you know, we're on track to invest about $250 million this year. We touch about 35 countries around the world, but it doesn't represent the whole of JPMorgan. You know, I joke all the time, we sort of have the best risk capital in the firm on many levels, but if you have the option of going after $250 million in philanthropy or a $2 trillion asset base in our balance sheet, which would you choose, right? So internally, my team's job is to create that internal pressure and to help us think differently as a firm on how we should be involved in this conversation. And I think some of the conversations today and a little bit yesterday just talked about this growing frustration, and it's everybody's issue now around income inequality, and it didn't used to be that way, right? Corporates didn't have to play in that space necessarily, and that's no longer true, and it's definitely not true for a bank. That said, we're well aware that traditional markets don't necessarily always work in favor of disadvantaged communities. So how can our foundation think about ways to complement what we do, but be clear about bringing the assets of our firm to the table? So whether it's our data, our people, our reach, our networks, our convening power, this is, you know, if you had to put a value on that, it would far exceed $250 million a year. And I think that's often what people miss when they think about corporate foundations in general. So what we do in our philanthropy is largely focused on increasing economic opportunity. I think the one thing that's really happening in the corporate foundation world in general, corporate responsibility in general, is, you know, people recognize it has to be connected and authentic to the brand of the corporate entity, right? It can't be that isolated basement shop and the do-good team and you call them when you need money for a dinner or some other type of cover. It's got to be, right, the conversation has to happen at the CEO level. And again, you really have to start with what you know and do as a firm. And the areas we've chosen to invest in, we feel like bring our expertise as a firm to the table. So New Skills at Work, it's a $250 million commitment we've made to closing the skills gap. Just a couple weeks ago, we've extended that commitment to include a $75 million program, which will be global, but the first piece of that is launching an RFP here in the US that will fund and promote those best-in-class CTE programs across the country. That's a systems play that corporations aren't really known for getting involved in. So that's interesting from a number of different angles. So one, building the credibility on our New Skills at Work commitment allowed people to listen and engage with us for a conversation on the CTE program. The other thing is, when you have a corporate entity, we're 240,000 employees. We want to bring the top talent to every single role we have. But we also bank the largest companies in the world, right? In the 60 countries where we have presence, we have clients across 100 countries around the world. We're banking employers who are talking to us about the very issues we're working on. And that's an important asset we bring to the table. But we were able to build that credibility over time and play in that systems level conversation because of that work. And I think that that's important. And it also just says something: if a corporate player is stepping up, other corporations will definitely look. You have to be really careful about who your constituents are. There are definitely activities that my partners here on the panel can get involved in that we can't. That said, if we're working behind the scenes together, we can all be effective about making sure we're using our voice appropriately. What do we need the corporate sector to be saying on this? What do we need family foundations to be saying on this? And I think that's an important tool that private sector hasn't always necessarily been asked to leverage. And sometimes we're just not leveraging it, but that's definitely not the way we approach it there. And I think the other areas we invest in also sort of reinforce what we think we do well as a business, from investing in small businesses, especially promoting access to capital for those communities that don't necessarily have great chances at getting credit in this new market, but also educating our constituents about the regulatory environment. And there are things that people think banks just don't want to do, as opposed to really getting educated and informed about when you're voting, when you're casting your vote, when you're thinking about the different legislation coming up in your state, the conversation happening at the congressional level. Are you aware of what some of those tools and policies will do to availability of credit? And I think that's important also in this state as well. But like I said, we want more private sector players in this room, so hopefully next year there will be.
We'll work on it.
Some of it just to create more pressure on us, and some of it because I think we need to hear the conversations that happened over the next 2 days.
Deal. Hilary, Ford has been rethinking, refocusing, all kinds of stuff, and everybody's been reading about it. Can you reflect upon sort of some of that discussion? And I want, especially if you can sort of touch upon how Ford thinks about philanthropy and government, because after all, some of the Ford programs have risen to this myth about philanthropy sort of does the experiments and government takes it to scale. And it's really hard to imagine in this political environment that model, if it ever was true, is going to be the model for the future. And I know you all have thought about that.
No, well, this is working. We've been thinking a lot about that. So Ford is about to celebrate its 80th anniversary. We're still not a household word. Someone just said to me in the elevator, "Oh, I've got a Ford Explorer. I love my car." But working with government is in our DNA. When we started, we literally paid for technical advisors to the India government. We helped to educate people for the constitutional courts, for South Africa, for Kenya. So we as a foundation for our entire history have been thinking deeply about these issues. I'd say one of the most important things we've done in the last couple of years since Darren came, and we've really been thinking about our role on issues like inequality, is to step back, is to understand that it all begins with the culture of an institution. And if you're an institution of professional people who are largely there because of their values, you have to start with what you value. So we spent a lot of time in Darren's first year with our board and with our staff asking ourselves, what does it actually mean to be a social justice foundation, which is what we call ourselves, and what makes us different as a result of that? And I'm going to get to a couple of lessons that's led us to, and 3 lessons in terms of our relationship with government. But it means for us as a foundation, we are focused on addressing root causes of inequality, and also trying to change systems that systematically exclude people, whether those are systems of practice or laws or beliefs. And we ended up kind of adopting some of the frameworks that Dalila Meadows has used about systems change, and saying, there's really 4 things that matter for us as a foundation, if that's the business we're in. One is the rules of the game. It's why we don't fund financial literacy programs, but we work on predatory lending, for example. A second is systems, and systems are government systems of money and goals that affect lives, like criminal justice systems or education systems, so changing systems. Third is changing power dynamics, and the last and probably most transformative is changing beliefs and belief systems. So we've used that framework as we've been thinking about what have we learned over our past, and what does that mean for how we think about our work going forward. And I'd say the 3 lessons are, 1, just where you started with, when Ford began in our early years, we had 3 beliefs that are no longer true, if they ever were. The first one was that philanthropy demonstrates and government scales. The second was that evidence drives adoption. If you have good evidence and you can just show people the evidence, they will do the logical thing. And the third is that we could think up something ourselves and then ask others to come along with us as we decided it was a really good idea and more people should get involved. And I think we're in a really, really different time now. Government is no longer seen as the solution. In fact, the dominant narrative is that we have to stop feeding the beast, that government is the problem. And so governments that are our critical partners are struggling because the story about them is that they're not competent. And then also their resources are very constrained. And we have convinced ourselves as a country that we don't want governments to have the resources to solve our problems. So not only is government, whether it's at the federal, the state, or the local level, not able to innovate to do new things, it's really struggling to keep the funding for things that have already been proven to work. So that has led us to feel, for the kind of foundation that we are, we need to focus much, much more on public will, on issues of public belief, and the stories we tell ourselves about why we have governments. And certainly, for sure, evidence alone is not going to drive adoption or solve the kinds of problems that we face. And if we take those steps, we have to co-create from the beginning with other partners, whether that's government or other foundations or the private sector. But you can't expect to shut the doors as a foundation, make it all up by yourself, and then think that the rest of the world is going to think you have a good idea. So that's kind of the first lesson that has caused us to make some pivots. The second is that I think philanthropy itself has inadvertently contributed to the degradation of people's opinion of government. And in part, we've done that by our infatuation with social entrepreneurship. Because if you think about the sort of version 1.0 of social entrepreneurs, much of that work set government up as a problem. Government does this badly. I have this great idea that's going to do it better. And lo and behold, what did we find out? The path to scale for those social enterprises is, guess what? Government and government funding. So I think that there is a way in which all the foundations tend to be faddish. All the fads sort of went to that way of thinking. You think about something that the Ford Foundation did many, many years ago, which was its awards for innovations in state and local government, that really tried to lift up not the elected officials, but the civil servants who stay in governments. Pam David was talking about this on her panel earlier, who are really the innovators and who are often innovating in very, very difficult circumstances with very little recognition. So I think philanthropy itself has actually contributed to undercutting a belief in government as an innovator and as a competent problem solver. And so we're trying to take that and think differently as we think about what our work looks like going forward and where we engage with governments. At what level? Is it the electeds or is it in the bowels of the systems? And then last but not least, because we are in the social justice game, you could look at us and say, what an incredible failure, 80 years. Have you made any progress on any issue of social justice that you're working on? And I think had to think a lot about that too, institutionally, and you have to be humble, and you have to realize privilege compounds, injustices in the world compound themselves, and privilege does not give up easily, and if you win a fight in social justice, it causes a reaction, and you're fighting the next fight. So we're trying hard as we think about how we program now to understand that fundamental dynamic. That is, in fact, the dynamic that we're in, and the fights we win will never stay won. So it means we're in the long game, and being in the long game means we have to have strong partners as organizations that we work with, and we have to really own up to the role that we as Philanthropy have also played in kind of what gets called the Starvation Cycle for the nonprofit sector, where we have our own cool ideas and we have our budgets, and we tell organizations, well, we've got $50,000 for you to do this thing that's going to fix poverty. And they are trained, they know it costs them more to do that work than we're willing to give them. But they tell us, yes, we can do it for that. And so the commitment that we've made to put $1 billion over the next 5 years into sort of general operating support to strengthen organizations is part of a recognition that we have to do better at that. And the shocking thing about the world we live in is, even though every executive director, and I used to be one, dreams of general operating support and knows that that's really important for them, we actually know as a sector incredibly little about what kind of money delivered at what stage in an organization's life cycle, for what, to pay for what kinds of things. It could be better salaries and benefits. For people, it should be for the boring stuff that we all pretend doesn't count. But we know very little about how that money, in fact, produces what we're calling stronger, more effective, and more durable organizations. And oh, by the way, how do we know what an effective nonprofit organization that works on social justice, in fact, even is? So it's been a really energizing process. It's been a really humbling process because we have way more questions than we have answers. But that's been part of the journey of our last 2 of our 80 years.
Well, thanks for sharing that. I think it's very enlightening and illuminating. Chris, you're sort of in the final years of Atlantic Philanthropies, and there's a lot of conversation in the philanthropic community, especially about donor intent. I won't use the word you don't like, limited life foundations. But can you sort of talk about sort of your strategy as y'all have been in these final years? How do you think about what impact you're going to make by accelerating, does sort of closing the doors at some point help you to accelerate impact where you're not worried about the next 10 years in terms of grant making, but you might be in terms of impact? Yeah. You want to talk about, that's a very different equation than many foundations sort of face.
Well, thanks, Jim, and thanks for having me here. Atlantic, as you know, has been anonymous for much of our grant-making life, and our culture has followed that of our founder, Chuck Finney, to be behind the scenes. And as we finish, we're actually interested in sharing more of our experience. And this is a limited space and time to do that, but we'd be very eager to share our experience as we conclude our work. Being a limited life organization, I think, has freed us up, given us a lot of flexibility to, as we say internally, spend to impact, not to budget. And I'm sorry I missed Bob Ross's comments yesterday, but it allowed us to make some big bets, both along the way and even as we conclude. And to your comment, you purposefully avoided the phrase spend down foundations, because that's the term that's used for organizations like ours. I've been fighting that phrase. And as the largest organization to go out of existence intentionally, I hope we'll have some influence on the use of that phrase, because it's not about winding down, spending out, spending down. It really is about maximizing your impact right up through the final grant-making period. Being a limited life organization has allowed us to go into what we call big bets, what we all talk about as big bets, not necessarily as single big bets, although we've made some of those, $350 million to launch the New York Cornell Tech campus. but also clusters around issues where we think we can have some impact in a relatively modest period of time within our lifetime. One example is our engagement in the school discipline reform area. And we have Layla Feister here, who's written a really good piece on tilling the fields, which describes Atlantic's clusters of investments around changing school discipline reform, changing the zero tolerance practices that have pushed kids out of school, sometimes referred to as school to prison pipeline. Within 5 years, we've invested over $45 million working with governments at different levels, school districts through to Department of Education, Department of Justice guidelines. So working with government at all levels, but doing it also in conjunction with higher education, developing curriculum on how to deal with discipline in the classroom, working not only with the carrot for government and school districts, but the stick, working with ACLU and the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and challenging some of these practices. So being an accelerated impact organization allowed us to deploy significant sums in these clusters of grants in a relatively short period of time that I think has made a significant difference. I mean, to Hilary's point, it's also about affecting perceptions, culture, the narrative, and I think we've seen some movement in a relatively short period of time. So the ability to go big soon, I think, has its benefits, and the not spending to budget but spending to impact has been very effective. That said, I don't want to suggest that we're looking for short-term results. A lot of what we care about, even with our limited life grant making, are very complex issues that extend well beyond the life of the organization. And so we're very interested in investing, for example, in human capital, or our founder in physical capital, things that have a life of 20, 30, or even longer years. The first grant that Chuck Feeney made out of the Atlantic Philanthropies, the Atlantic Foundation, in 1982, forgive me, was for the Cornell tradition, a $7 million grant for individuals in need, in higher education, financial need, but dedicated to community service. 30 years later, some of those people are leading actors in the world of philanthropy and nonprofit practice. And they refer to those bets as being, that initial grant as being very influential in their lives. I'm reminded of Frank Rhodes, our former chairman, who quoted the John Kennedy story about the French general who instructed his gardener to plant a tree, and the gardener says, well, that kind of tree, it's not going to bloom for 100 years. And the general said, all the more reason for you to do it right now. We're doing the same thing. Our final bets are going to be in human capital around the themes that we care about, health equity, racial equity, inequality, and democracy, because we recognize these are challenging issues that are not solved with a limited life program or a specific objective. But like the Cornell tradition, we expect that it's going to launch people and actors who are going to be influential and effective longer term. So I don't want to equate limited life philanthropy with just looking at problems that can be solved in a short term. There are a few of those that we care about. So we recognize that planting those seeds, launching those ships today can have longer term impact. It does present a lot of challenges to be a limited life organization. I think there's a sense of urgency to what we do that requires some real rigor in our decision making. It's very easy, as we all know, in the world of philanthropy to get pulled in 100 directions, even within the spaces that we specialize and occupy. There are so many great opportunities and so many great organizations and people that it's really difficult to remain focused. And Elizabeth McCormick, who used to be on our board, would always talk about the Einstein letter to Rockefeller. You know, says, if you could give me $1,000, I might be able to do something with it. And Rockefeller says, this guy might be onto something, give him a grant. We're always afraid of missing the next Einstein in our efforts to be focused. But that is the challenge, and we've, I think, in our final phase, are pulling back and looking at the themes that we've funded historically and in the geographies where we've been historically. And as I said, believe that an investment in human capital and influential leaders is the best final bet, big bet we will make. This is going to, depending on how the markets are doing today, I don't know, we're probably going to invest close to $400 to $500 million within the next year on those kinds of initiatives.
Amazing. I'm going to let y'all sort of pose questions to each other, but before you do, it just strikes me that all four of you in your grant making, your philanthropic work outside of the United States. So the theme of philanthropy and government, as we've programmed it, has largely been within the borders of the United States. Do y'all get more nervous or more bold or more reticent when you go across that border? And sort of what's your calculation as y'all do that?
As a corporate player, you have a number of different things to think about when we go outside of the U.S., and the conversation is very different as well outside of the U.S. One asset we have is we're doing business in all of the places where we have philanthropy. That's true for California, it's true for the countries we're in. So we do have a team on the ground that can bring that local intel to the table. But at the end of the day, if you're in India, we're the New York City big bank, right? And the regulatory environment outside of the U.S. is, if you think the U.S. has a negative view, sort of anti-big bank view, I mean, it's actually much worse in London and some other parts of the world. But in India, for instance, there's now a 2% tax, CSR tax. So any company operating there, 2% of their, they went from pre-tax to revenue to operating income. It's sort of still kind of an open item, but it has to be dedicated to CSR. And the only organizations you can fund that will qualify have to be designated by the Indian government. South Africa has a B scorecard, a Black Economic Empowerment scorecard. And if you don't get a great score, you can't actually do business in South Africa. Not as restrictive, a slightly different setup than the India work. It works a little bit more like the Community Reinvestment Act here in the US, but same kind of thing. So if you wanted to fund this type of work, but there isn't necessarily the credit, if you will, on the scorecard, it's hard for corporations to sort of think about what the best thing is to do. And I think the other thing is you really do have to understand what the public funding and government landscape is in that country, which is all these structures are very different than what we have in the US. In Europe, you're having a lot of funding come from the government, and it's driving a lot of the work there, and corporates play in a very narrow space. So you have to be careful about what that looks like. But I do think there's just, again, growing sentiment that corporations aren't doing enough. And so whether it's a formal legislation in place that corporates need to be giving more, or just the expectation, this is true in Korea and China, you probably read about in Russia where they've outlawed. I mean, we've had to pause in several countries because sort of the government's view on what it is for a US-based foundation to do work in that country. And that, that's when you're trying to go to a country that might not have a strong not-for-profit infrastructure, that can be a tough choice. It's sort of, you can give poorly or you cannot give. Neither is a great choice. So how do you think about that in the context of the work? I think the other thing, sometimes we don't always do well as U.S. foundations, is you're bringing your U.S. view to another place, as opposed to, regardless of what I want to focus on here, is that a relevant issue to get behind in that place? Do I have a relevant voice to credibly attack that issue? And do I know what the root cause is? Or am I assuming the root cause is the same as what I've chosen to fund here? Sometimes we say, oh, the issue is financial inclusion, so I'm going to fund bank accounts, in that country. Well, India has actually a ton of bank accounts that have opened since they forced basically everybody to get a bank account. The problem is nobody uses them, so that that doesn't really work if you're trying to change the game on financial inclusion. So it's a lot harder to do. It's not as big numbers for us, but I think we need to take a whole lot more time to figure out how to be most effective in those countries and recognize that sometimes there is going to be inefficiency there, and sometimes you do have to decide if it's better to pause.
Yeah, it is really exciting about the amount of interaction between philanthropy and work internationally. And for those of us, I think Larry talking on the opening panel, for all of us, we find what issues do we want to work on, and then where do we have to go to make some difference there. And so for Packard, actually our biggest areas of commitment are global climate change and healthy oceans. Both of those cross geographies. But it's where collaboration has really made a difference. So Hewlett and Packard and maybe 10 or 11 other global foundations have this organization called Climate Works, which you can check out its website, but really provides that infrastructure for collaboration with emphasizing some of the themes that I mentioned earlier about, we each play different roles, we understand our relationships, sometimes it's the inside game, sometimes it's the outside game. So Climate Works, but then also the theme of this panel was what's infrastructure is needed, and so I know the Hilton folks are here and others who are very involved with setting up the platforms for the SDGs and then looking at how do we add on the metrics for what came out of Paris. So, the use of data, information, structures to build relationships to allow coordination among philanthropy. I think we're all getting better at that, and many of you in the room are very involved with it.
Board has been in the crosshairs of exactly the kind of issues that you were talking about, Dalila, which is, I think, a shrinking space for civil society in general in many countries in the world, and in particular, a rejection of Western, a deep suspicion of Western philanthropy, Western motives, and therefore Western philanthropic engagement. So it matters to have strong partners who are from and of those communities. And then I think to Carol's point, so many of the hardest problems in the world are actually the nation state is ill-equipped to solve, whether it's refugee crises or migration or climate change. And so I think that's a place where philanthropy, whether it's US-based or anywhere in the world, has a real opportunity to begin to try to imagine what different decision-making structures or ways of working together could we hold a space for, because it's really hard for nation states, given what they are, to think about that or imagine that. And then the last thing I would say, I think Lester Solomon is in here, who is doing some very interesting work looking at privatization and ways in which, as assets are privatized, whether they are formerly state-owned banks or telephone companies or assets under the ground or assets in the air or illicit assets that have left a country into a Swiss bank account, what does it mean to recapture some of those and turn them into community-owned foundations, or where there's a source of capital that can be decided about and spent by the community and in a place. So I think there's also some very interesting opportunities created by the moment that we're in, but it's a very complicated one, and I know you struggle with a lot of the same things.
We do. Atlantic has made grants in 24 countries, predominantly in 7 where we've had offices and program focus. And most of those, I would say, have been driven by opportunities to work with government or to challenge government. And we really have been focusing on certain kinds of system development, whether it's health systems in Vietnam and South Africa, or whether it's higher education and research in places like Australia, in Ireland, where we've gone to governments who I have to say are open. In other words, we're kind of looking for an environment where things are ready to move. And we talk sometimes about catching the wave. Very entrepreneurial sense, in part by our founder, Chuck Feeney, getting a sense that the environment is ripe to really partner with government and elevate what they're doing. So, for example, in Ireland, we came in the late 80s and 90s, through the 90s, to partner with government on raising investments in research in higher education institutions. And it really elevated the higher education and research sector in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. But because the government was itself ready for it, we talk sometimes about going to scale. In fact, it was an opportunity to just encourage the government to think bigger if we could add our resources to the pot. It wasn't like they were not capable of going to scale, but they benefited from the wind in the sails of additional support and encouragement. Same in Queensland and Australia. There was a premier there, Peter Beattie, who was trying to promote what they call the smart state, some really dynamic researchers in health sciences, some really promising institutions, and the state was really prepared to invest in what they call the knowledge economy. So the situation was very open and receptive and aligned. So I think catching the wave with governments has been a theme in some of our work outside the U.S. But we've also worked to hold governments to account. In South Africa during the Mbeki period and AIDS denialism, we supported groups like the Treatment Action Campaign with Ford and others who were giving voice to people affected and who were demanding changes in government policy. And like you say, you can't just come up with evidence. Evidence doesn't just solve the problem, and advocacy and social movement is definitely what gives force to the right options. We've worked, of course, with the government in Cuba on health. What Cuba has done in public health and the Latin American School of Medicine was really a good model for some of the health work we were doing in South Africa and Vietnam in low-resource environments. Those models and that practice had more relevance to the countries we were working in than some of the more developed countries elsewhere. So working with government was a critical part of trying to inform and change health systems, research, and higher education systems. Critical.
Great. Do you all have questions for one another before I go to my list?
I have
Hilary?
a question for Chris.
Yeah.
I loved how you were talking about what it means to be able to make big bets. I'm curious, how important is the 20 years or more of quiet, behind-the-scenes experience you had to your ability to be smart about those big bets? Because I think one of the challenges for a lot of people coming newly into philanthropy with very large amounts of money is there is this sort of feeling that the big bet is the good bet.
Yeah.
And many of those institutions are making very big bets while they're very inexperienced at philanthropy.
Really great question. I think part of the reason we were anonymous, and that really goes to Chuck Feeney, the founder, was this sense that there was a lot to learn and explore and listen. And a lot of some of the bets initially were small bets that led to larger bets. There's a lot of learning and listening that goes on to be effective, as you know. And we have examples of some big bets that probably didn't work. We're going to talk about our 10 big mistakes, probably. At some point, although we have to be sensitive to the
Good
people
for you.
who were probably prompted by us to make mistakes.
Yeah, right.
But that goes to the issue of risk too, and the fact we all talk about in the world of philanthropy that if you're not failing, you're not trying hard enough. Chuck Feeney doesn't like that. But I keep talking, and many of you have heard me say this, that we remember Babe Ruth, the home runs, not for the fact that he was the strikeout king, and if you bat 300 or more, that's pretty good. So big bets require, I think, some thoughtful listening and learning and some reflection. I mean, people talk about the Mark Zuckerberg big bet in Newark as a challenge. These are complicated areas,
Yeah.
and so just dumping a big chunk of money is certainly not always the answer.
I hope you do figure out how to tell those stories. It's important.
It's
I was
my-
going to ask Hilary a question. So all of us, anyone who's ever worked for a major foundation is, you feel like sometimes you're in a constant state of strategic evaluation, and we're going through this assessment. But obviously, this is a big moment for Ford. I know one of the toughest things to do during that process, we just did it a few years ago, is how you're communicating to your grantees. So I would love to hear, what are your grantees, how are they reacting, to this work and some of the lessons that you've talked about kind of in closed rooms and, you know, on the big stage, and how are you managing those relationships?
Not well enough. I mean, and who, you know, there's what they say to us and there's what they say to each other. I think we're driving them crazy. It's taking us a long time. One of the reasons is because we really do fundamentally believe that, you know, foundations have a habit. Leadership changes and then the strategy changes, or they just decide because they've been doing something long enough that they're going to do it differently. And so we've been trying to, one of the reasons we've taken the time and done the shared kind of thinking that we've been trying to do is in the belief that we can create a much more nimble organization where program officers on the front lines and in our regional offices are not executing a narrow strategy, you know, with a focus in a kind of, we have blindfolders on way, but in a way that is generative and agile, I think, Carol, to use your words. But that's been taking a long time. We're talking too much to ourselves. We've been trying hard to communicate through Darren's various kinds of missives and through our program officers. We set up last year, we took 25% of our resources and we put it into a transition fund so that we could give tie-off grants to long-term grantees. You know, we are in the honeymoon phase, which will end soon, because people are going to see that, yes, we did say we're going to put $1 billion into these, you know, organizations fighting social injustice. Right now, everyone in the world reads that and says, that's me. And soon we'll be making some choices, and it won't be everyone. And people will begin to realize when Darren said we're going to be making fewer grants and have fewer grantees, that we actually are going to be making fewer grants and having fewer grantees. So I'd say we're doing the best we can to be transparent and to recognize that, you know, Ford is, we have been in many fields for a very long time. We've helped to build fields, and that means, the best of that means that we have very long-term relationships with particular organizations. The worst of that means that neither we nor they have ever been responsible about their level of dependence on us. So it's a complicated, as you well know, set of transitions, and we're working our way through, and I would actually love to get people's feedback, because I'm sure you all hear a lot more about whether we're doing it well than we do.
Chris?
I wanted to follow up with Carol about the challenges of collaboration. You know, the ideals of getting multiple parties working together, whether it's foundations, actors, we all agree is desirable. But the realities are that it's so tough with some diversity of perspectives and approaches. Maybe personalities sometimes happen to be part of the challenge. We don't do enough of it even as foundations. We talk about it, we co-fund. We sometimes manage to get together at the right time and do the right thing. But it's hard because each individual player is invested in what they do, and time and perspectives constrain opportunity for collaboration. People feel left out if they're not included. You know, the African proverb, if you want to move quickly, travel alone. If you want to travel far, travel with a group. But it's not as fast. How do you deal with some of these challenges of herding cats?
Yeah. So they're always messy, right? I mean, I think all of the various levels of collaboration that we've been involved in, they're a little bit messy because it involves people and relationships and different angles. It does really change over time. So I think it gets down to that, the relationship of trust among each other and being united around that common goal. To use even the example that I gave with the park system. So after Steve McCormick initiated all this out of Moore, he transitioned out of Moore. And actually coming into play with that was then Bechtel with Lori Dax really taking a big lead. So the leadership within the group changed and had to accommodate, but it lasted even though people changed and perspectives changed and governance changed. So I think it all comes to building up, putting that time into the relationship piece. Similarly, we've been working in, like to take an example out of the climate work, in Indonesia. So we've been working with Ford, and with Cargill and with a number of other foundations that have been focused on preserving forests in Indonesia. So now we were all worried about, with Ford making its announcements, would that fall away? But again, because of the relationships that we've had among these foundations, we're continuing to find the right niche. So all I can say is, yes, it happens, life happens, and people change, but we're so committed to the ultimate goal that pretty much someone picks up the lead and does something different on it.
As a practical matter, how do you do that, though? How do you build and sustain trust? Is regular convenings,
Yeah.
regular interaction?
And then, like I said, there's a backbone often in this. So in the case of the work in Indonesia and in the case of the work in Parks Forward as well, there is there's someone who's tasked, and actually we pay a facilitator to bring us together, Resources Legacy Fund or whatever. And then I think where's Larry? Diffused reciprocity is the term that he's used. But, how do you build relationships? So I'm just thinking about my conversations with Lori. She wouldn't mind me saying this. Barbara's here, who's working with her so closely. We care about each other being successful, too. And so it means that there's something else I can help her out with and go a little bit outside of something I might ordinarily do. So no matter how big the pieces are, it does come down to individual goodwill and anyway, so I think in the two that I've mentioned, Parks Forward and also Climate and Land Use Alliance, which is part of Climate Works, that building up of relationship and real personal connections that allow us to lighten up a little bit, It's not just about the way we're doing what we're aiming for. It's about relationship and moving together in the right direction.
This collaboration conversation, several of the other ones are, oftentimes it requires not strategy, but changes in culture. And there's a piece, many people in the room are good friends with Jim Canales, and he wrote a piece in the Chronicle of Philanthropy about 1.5 years ago talking about how philanthropy really needed to change its default settings, right? And he talked about, that we need to move from what's new to what's working, from models and metrics to adaptation and learning. I've got this to we've got this, which is sort of the collaboration piece, and how do I look versus what do we see? So as you lead your organizations, going back to the leadership question, how do you go about creating the culture in the foundations that allows you to make a bigger difference? And how, any insights or thoughts about that? Is philanthropy getting better at it? Do you feel like we're getting, making some inroads on that?
Sustainability is a phrase we all use, and we often apply it to sustainability of an organization because that organization is effective, and we hope it will continue to be effective, and that it needs time and resources to sustain its work. I think shifting to sustainability of the outcome is a way of both enhancing collaboration and refocusing, for example, our program staff around not a particular singular relationship, but again, thinking more broadly about how can you achieve an outcome of which your cluster of relationships is a part. This is especially evident to us as we've been going out of business because a lot of our relationships are concluding. We've had a great degree of reliance on us in places like Ireland, for example, where we worked with diverse groups in the rights sector and where our funding has been the principal funding for their work. And as we withdraw, it's kind of highlighted this notion of these organizations may or may not be sustainable, but they should think of ways to sustain their efforts to achieve a shared outcome or desired outcome. And so we are exploring and have been exploring with them how that can be done. So eyes on the prize. What's our collective idea of what should be achieved that extends beyond our role within a foundation, our grantees' continued existence. And maybe there are entities that should have limited lives, just like Atlantic has a limited life. So it's really outcome-oriented rather than sustaining the life of a particular entity that I think can enhance collaboration, enhance effective approaches to philanthropy.
Carol?
Well, and it's so much fun to go back and forth between those foundations who are of limited life and those who are planning on perpetuity. I mean, Dave didn't insist that we stay in existence forever, but we're pretty much committed to going at least through this next generation. And so for all intents and purposes, it's perpetuity. But in addition to eyes on the prize and the goal and uniting around that, there really is something for us, and I think this is true outside of family foundations, in that starting with the top. In our case, it was the founders and now their progeny who really insist on a set of values and an operating principle. HP as a company had the HP way. I know Larry and Hewlett are very much affected by these things too. So I think it's been important for us to get better in philanthropy by keeping on reinforcing those values within the foundation, because they're good ones for effective philanthropy. It's a good mix of values. So we do that by a whole bunch of mechanisms. We bring the family in and talk about examples from the past, bring in people who knew Dave and Lucile. We advertise, when we post job descriptions, we talk about the values and we interview people around them. We also reward people within the foundation. And a lot of these values have to do with how we orient to the world, to grantees. So there's a heavy deference, heavy respect, respect for the grantee listening. The approach on evaluation is about continuous improvement and changing. It's not about strict accountability from the outside, It's about belief in individual leadership. So I just think there are many ways to reinforce it within your organization and to find what those orienting values are in your organization, whether you're a family foundation or not. We have 120 employees. We have about 15% turnover every year. And for me, as someone been there for so long, I have to keep reminding myself that people don't just absorb, people don't just read a job description. It takes constant affirmation as we turn new staff in a really healthy way. But I think reinforcing that culture from many angles is so important, at least in our organization.
I think that's, well, you want to go first? I really like what you each had to say, and I think, changing culture is really hard, and nurturing, stewarding culture is really important. I think in general in foundations, we don't think hard enough about the role of program officers. I do agree that it sort of starts at the top and that a lot has to do with how we interact with others, but I think most foundations are fairly conflicted about the role of program officers. They don't know whether they should be there a long time or a short time. They don't know if they want them to really strongly ally with the grantees, or they should worry about them going native and advocating for the grantee and not the institution. So if you think of them as really the frontline workers through which we have impact, I think we don't probably, we create all kinds of very odd conflicting incentives on them. So even the notion of my budget, or my initiative. So we've been thinking a lot about how to try to shift from I to we, and also when you work on really hard problems that require intersectionality, how do you create an institution where the people in it have the time and the habit of mind to work that way? And how do you do that in foundations which are on the receiving end of so much desire and need? We're not poor us, but that's actually a very real thing if you're an ethical person and you're a program officer. So I think we don't tend to think deeply enough about that, and a lot of our ability to change our culture or have an impact, I think, depends on getting smarter or wiser about that particular role. At least we're struggling with how to do that, think about that.
I think what's interesting is the philanthropic sector as a whole is very self-aware, right? Those issues that Jim called on are not things we haven't been talking about, but clearly we haven't seen that transformative shift. So we talk about using our resources as risk capital and making those big bets, but our structures then ask for more data and evidence than is reasonable, right? Before we will even give a grant. And we haven't changed that infrastructure, that organizational design, like Hilary just focused on, to really encourage some of that. We talk about bringing different voices to the table and cross-sector collaboration, but there's still more co-funding than collaboration at the end of the day. We will all agree on kind of the conceptual vision, but we still haven't got, to what Chris was talking about, which is, are we in agreement on the outcome, and are we willing to do something different to get there? Right? So if I'm just willing to do what I was already doing, because I think my outcome sounds close enough to Chris, like that's not really collaboration, right? There's so much of it that's still about people wanting to be first, or known. I want my brand to be the brand on climate change rather than just part of a team or part of a collective effort. And I think there's still a lot of that there that we need to break down. And just back to kind of encouraging different voices, it's not just cross-sector, but how are we thinking about the millennial generation and how they partake in this conversation and the pace at which things move today? I can guarantee you, more people were talking about Beyonce information this weekend than they were about any of our foundations. And how do we tap into that? There is something there that we are not touching right now that we need to grab hold of and sort of light those voices, but show those voices like, okay, don't make the mistakes that we made in the past, right? Don't just be a slacktivism action, but like, let's figure out how to move it and sort of share with them what we've learned and not just sit back and say we're kind of holier than thou because we have a big structure and a balance sheet, et cetera. And I don't think we encourage those type of conversations as much as we used, as much as we should, even though, again, like I say, we're all very self-aware that these issues exist, but we all live in cultures that have been built over centuries. I mean, most of the philanthropic efforts, at least in the United States, all were based on a family value, right? So for us, it's JPMorgan, it's the Rockefellers, and so many of the legacy families that sort of influence the values we have, and that's true for most major foundations. But we still are stuck there in a way that's been very hard to move from.
My name's Steve Pontel. I'm president of a National Community Renaissance, but I've been on the board of a foundation for the last 5 years. And my question to you is, piggybacking on the last comment, is how do any of you have a way that you structurally prevent groupthink? And one of the things that I've observed is I was outed by my board, by my president and CEO yesterday. I tend to be the outlier on the board that I'm on, is within philanthropy, there does seem to be pretty monolithic perspectives. And so I'm just curious, do any of you intentionally bring in the completely other view and have the conversation and expand those horizons?
Again, I would say it starts from the top again, the board, and if you're on a board, of just, you can't get through a meeting without having someone ask you, well, what's the opposing view on it? Where are we hearing the other thing? But, often we even package the opposing views, really, honestly, as staff, but I think the board can really ask those questions and say, make sure that, they hear from others. The other one that I think is a theme of this conference, and Monica Lozano talked about it, certainly our board pushes us to do it, Hewlett and Ford, and particularly Hilary and personal leadership with Faye Twersky, have been focused on beneficiary feedback loops. And so, there's this fund for shared insight, which Hilary could tell us more about, but I think we really, as foundations, we aren't very good, not just at the beginning of the strategy, but as it's going on, really hearing from people effectively. The most we've done, the best we've done at Packard so far, has been much more engagement of all of the other funders in the area that we're looking at, and all of the leading nonprofits in that area. that we don't ever bring a strategy or an idea to the board without having brought those on a road show and really had them poke at it and say what was right or wrong of it. But I do think that we often just do it within our silos, so I think those are board beneficiary feedback, and then just insisting that you get those kinds of inputs.
Yeah, I would say we don't do anything systematically, but we do try to bring in some unexpected voices that probably get surprised when they're asked to come to JPMorgan Chase World Headquarters to come in and talk to our team. One, we give them open space to criticize what we're doing, either as a corporate entity or as a foundation. And two, and this is I think the harder part, is sort of ask them for ideas and suggestions and solutions. And I think the two don't often come together, and so we're still trying to find out how it's more of a dialogue. But we do things inside the bank, so we have forums to talk about. So we create these forums, so our team is getting some of that feedback directly.
I think the board has a very key role, and governance is really important. That a board is in some ways the most distant perspective on what an organization is doing, and has to have a critical role in what's happening. And I know there too you're striking a balance between being supportive and encouraging and critical and demanding and holding things to account. But I think there are points in Atlantic's history where our board went on automatic and wasn't maybe aware of what was happening to the extent that they should have been or could have been. Too much stuff coming at them in ways that weren't particularly clear, and so they let things slide. So I think the board is certainly a significant player in accountability and critiquing performance and avoiding just business as normal and groupthink.
I was just curious, in a world where it is now in the United States commonplace for private funding to play in the political sector in order to shape public policy, how do you think about your changing role and giving your limitations or lack of limitations in the case of you, Dalila, and the broader infrastructure that, for example, a corporation like JPMorgan Chase has to drive policy?
This has been much more of a discussion topic for us internally, just as my team works more closely with GR than ever before. We don't have a formal public policy team. But what we know is our actions, whether we're directly lobbying or not, completely impact public policy conversation, and sometimes you're doing that behind the scenes, and sometimes it's very intentional. There are plenty of shareholder resolutions for companies to think differently about disclosure on lobbying activities, which I think is interesting. If we get to that level, we're not one of the more active PAC contributors and active as some other companies, just in terms of the way we operate. Just like most entities, we're giving on both sides, and sometimes it'll impact our broader work in philanthropy, and sometimes it doesn't. But I think we're still trying to figure it out. Oftentimes we're doing that with and through our partners, quite frankly. We're not working directly with C4s on my team ever. It doesn't mean that you can't have a conversation about policy, but the lines slip very quickly, especially when we were more active in education and as we moved into workforce. Of course, a lot of that funding, the real money, is at the state level. Like, we all know that. And we also know the incentives aren't in the right place on workforce. And we want to be able to influence that and bring organizations like NGA and others to the table. So there are places we can play, and we get close to the line, definitely, I think, in this country on education and workforce. But I think we're still trying to figure out what's the best approach for us, because there's a lot of reputation risk involved on either side. There are a lot of times my team may be willing to engage in activity, and somebody else in the firm, any day I could be offending anybody. Somebody else in the firm is not necessarily in agreement, and we all have to make a call as to whether, we want to go forward with it. Which is not a restriction or a risk that some other foundations think about. But I think it's a tricky space for us, and we're still figuring it out.
Okay. Well, I want to thank our distinguished panel for their insights and openness. And I want to thank all of y'all again for joining us for this conversation. It's been very energetic, thought-provoking, and I think it's led to a greater understanding of what it really takes to work at that intersection of philanthropy and government, and sort of the range of assets that philanthropy has to really make a difference in systems and ecosystems, going back to the morning's session. So hopefully with this conversation and understanding, you'll find the courage and conviction to sort of act, whatever that is, okay? So thank y'all all.